Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to dig into the very foundations of our legal system, but through a really powerful lens, feminist jurisprudence. And look, this isn't just some dusty academic theory. It's actually a tool that helps us see how the law, which we often think of as totally neutral, has been shaped by gender and power. And that impacts everything, from our paychecks to our personal safety.
So before we get into the weeds, let's start with a big foundational question that really gets to the heart of this whole thing. What is the hidden system shaping our laws and, by extension, our entire society? Think of it like an invisible architecture that quietly decides who gets power, who gets protection, and who gets left behind.
All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First up, we're going to define the core problem that feminism is responding to. Then we'll dive into the counter-narrative itself. After that, we'll take a tour through the major schools of feminist thought, see how they've evolved, and we'll wrap up by looking at why this all still matters so much today in the fight over our own bodies.
Okay, let's dive in. To understand the solution, you first have to get a crystal clear picture of the problem. And that starts with a word you've probably heard thrown around a lot, patriarchy. But to really grasp what it means in a legal sense, we need to be super precise.
Now, it's really important to get this straight. Patriarchy isn't about individual men being bad. Not at all. It's a system. You can think of it as the default setting for society, one where, historically, things like political leadership, moral authority, and, control of property have been concentrated in the hands of men. It's a structure that automatically puts women and other genders in a subordinate spot. And this system isn't just in one little corner of life. It's everywhere. The source material actually breaks it down into 6 key structures where it operates. We're talking about stuff like the gender pay gap at work, the unspoken expectation that women do most of the unpaid labor at home, the way women are portrayed in culture and media, and, this is the big one, how the state itself writes laws and policies that often end up reinforcing male interests. So, if patriarchy is the established order, what's the rebellion? What's the counterattack? Well, that brings us to feminism, the powerful direct response to this whole imbalance.
You see, feminism is so much more than just a belief in equality. It's a full-blown socio-political movement. It's an active ideology that doesn't just want to critique patriarchy from the sidelines. It wants to dismantle it, piece by piece, and fight for real, tangible justice in every part of our lives. And when you put these two side by side, the contrast just pops, doesn't it? It's so stark. Where patriarchy depends on these rigid, top-down social roles to keep control, feminism is all about promoting fluidity and equality. At the end of the day, the outcome of one is systemic oppression, while the other is fighting for social justice. They are fundamentally opposing forces.
But here's the thing. There isn't just one single way to tear down a system. Feminism is really a collection of different theories. You can think of them as different toolkits, each with its own set of tools for taking on patriarchy. So let's take a look at the foundational schools of thought that gave us these first crucial toolkits. The 3 big ones that really laid the groundwork are liberal, radical, and socialist feminism. And as you'll see, each one identifies a slightly different target, which means each one comes up with a very different game plan for getting to equality. First up is liberal feminism. This one basically argues that the system itself is more or less okay. The big problem is that women have been unfairly excluded from it. So the goal isn't to tear down the whole house, it's to make sure everyone gets a key to the front door. This means fighting for things like equal pay laws, voting rights, and getting rid of formal discrimination. But, and this is a huge but, the major critique here is that this approach doesn't really challenge the fundamental biases of the system itself. Critics famously called it the add women and stir method. It might help some privileged women get a seat at the existing power table, but it does very little to question whether the table itself is designed fairly. Then, in pretty much direct opposition, you have radical feminism. This school of thought argues that the entire system is the problem. It's not about getting a seat at the table, it's about flipping the whole table over. It says patriarchy itself is the absolute root of all oppression, and it's built on controlling women's bodies and their sexuality. So for them, true liberation isn't just about laws. It demands a total transformation of power, even in our most private, intimate lives. Of course, this school has its own critics too. By focusing so intensely on patriarchy as the #1 struggle, it's been accused of ignoring how things like race, class, and other factors create completely different experiences of womanhood. It runs the risk of treating woman as this one single uniform category, and that just isn't the reality for most people.
And that brings us to socialist feminism, which says, hold on, you can't separate the fight for gender equality from the fight for economic equality. This view sees capitalism and patriarchy as these two tween engines of oppression that work together hand in hand to exploit women. So, if you want to bring one down, you absolutely have to fight both at the same time.
Now, these foundational schools were absolutely revolutionary, but they also had some pretty significant blind spots. And the critiques they faced, especially from women of color and women from the Global South, forced a really crucial evolution in how we think about feminism.
This led to what is arguably the most important shift in modern feminism, the move from focusing only on gender to what's called an intersectional approach. The core idea here is that you just can't understand gender discrimination in a vacuum. All these systems of oppression, based on race, class, sexuality, ability, they don't just exist side by side. They overlap, they intersect, and they compound each other.
And if you want a devastatingly clear example of intersectionality in the real world, you just have to look at the concept of caste patriarchy, which comes from analysis of the social system in India.
Under this system, women from lower castes, especially Dalit women, face this just brutal double burden. They experience the oppression of patriarchy within their own communities, and they face the oppression of the caste system from the wider society. And the results are just horrific. Staggering rates of sexual violence, total economic exclusion, and a level of systemic dehumanization that's hard to even fathom.
This kind of realization gave rise to these incredibly vital new schools of thought. Post-colonial feminism, for example, directly challenges the Western-centric worldview of a lot of early feminism. And in the same way, the lit feminism critiques mainstream Indian feminism for basically ignoring the specific severe oppression created by the caste system.
And all of this brings us right up to the modern-day battleground, where these theories all come together. Because so much of the legal fight today comes down to one central, intensely personal question: who gets to control our bodies?
Yeah, the fight for bodily autonomy is absolutely central to modern feminism. And this shows up in a lot of different ways. It's the fight against the commodification of women's bodies in industries like pornography. It's the fight for reproductive rights, recognizing that you can't have economic freedom without control over your own body. And, of course, it's the fight against sexual violence, which movements like #MeToo brought to the forefront so powerfully. So, if there's one core takeaway from all of these theories, from liberal to post-colonial and everything in between, it's this: the law is not neutral. It is never just some abstract set of rules floating above us. It is a mirror that reflects society's power structures, and it is the very battleground where we fight over what justice and equality even mean.
Which leaves us with one final, crucial question to think about. If the law really does reflect our society's values, whose values does it actually reflect? And who gets to make that decision?